For more than a century, the United States has been regarded as the world's leading superpower, enjoying unmatched advantages in economic strength, military capability, and technological innovation. Its aircraft carrier fleets operate across the world's oceans, while its cutting-edge scientific achievements and immense financial resources have enabled Washington to maintain a dominant leadership role in shaping the international order. For decades, the unipolar world order with the United States at its center was widely viewed as an enduring reality. Behind this image of overwhelming power, however, lies a far more complicated story. America's greatest challenge has not come solely from external rivals, but also from a series of policy decisions made by its own leaders over several decades. Excessive confidence and an unwavering belief in American supremacy allowed strategic mistakes to accumulate, gradually weakening the nation's long-term foundation of power. The numbers tell a compelling story. Trillions of dollars in taxpayer money have been spent on prolonged military conflicts and controversial policies, creating an enormous financial burden. At the same time, overseas military campaigns have not only drained American resources but have also significantly diminished the country's credibility and influence on the global stage. Even more striking is the fact that many decisions made in the White House unintentionally accelerated this decline. Relationships with long-standing allies became increasingly strained, while the global economic and financial system experienced growing instability. These developments created favorable conditions for the international order to gradually shift from a unipolar system to a multipolar one. In this changing environment, the US dollar's unquestioned dominance has become less certain. Western influence has weakened in many regions, and emerging powers have grown increasingly confident in shaping the rules of international affairs. Every major strategic decision made without a credible contingency plan has gradually eroded America's competitive advantages. Rather than remaining the unquestioned leader of the global order, the United States has increasingly found itself confronting the unintended consequences of its own choices. From the perspective of chaos theory, these developments represent more than simple policy miscalculations. They also reflect excessive confidence and an underestimation of the complex dynamics governing global geopolitics. A single poorly considered decision in Washington can trigger ripple effects that reshape the international balance of power. In today's video, we will examine 6 strategic mistakes widely regarded as major turning points in American history. The consequences of these decisions have contributed significantly to the serious economic, political, and geopolitical challenges now confronting the world's leading superpower. If you enjoy in-depth analyses of history, economics, and geopolitics, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest content. Mistake number 1. The Iraq War of 2003. In 2003, despite opposition from many European allies and widespread skepticism within the United Nations Security Council, the United States launched a military campaign to overthrow the government of President Saddam Hussein. Washington argued that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and maintained ties to terrorist organizations, presenting these claims as justification for a war that was said to protect international security and promote democracy in the Middle East. After coalition forces gained control of Iraq, however, no stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction were ever found. This raised serious questions about the political justification for the invasion and significantly damaged Washington's credibility in the eyes of the international community. Instead of achieving a swift and decisive victory, the U.S. military soon became entangled in a prolonged insurgency that lasted for years. Military expenditures soared, budget deficits continued to grow, thousands of American service members lost their lives, and tens of thousands more returned home with life-changing injuries. The war ultimately cost an estimated $3 trillion, much of it financed through government borrowing, placing an even greater burden on the U.S. economy, while fueling public skepticism about overseas military interventions. The most significant consequence of the Iraq War was not simply its enormous financial cost or tragic loss of life, but its profound impact on the balance of power in the Middle East. Before 2003, Although Saddam Hussein's government was openly hostile toward the United States, it also served as a counterweight to Iran's regional ambitions. Once the Iraqi state collapsed, a massive power vacuum quickly emerged. Iran seized this opportunity to expand its regional influence by cultivating close ties with Iraq's new government, supporting various militia groups, and establishing a network of influence stretching from Iran through Iraq and Syria to the Mediterranean Sea. As a result, the United States invested tremendous resources in the conflict, but ultimately helped create conditions that strengthened one of its principal strategic rivals. The Middle East consequently entered a prolonged period of instability that continues to challenge policymakers to this day. The second mistake, the Afghanistan War 2001. If the Iraq War is often viewed as the result of disputed intelligence, the war in Afghanistan became America's longest and most expensive military conflict in modern history. Following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, Washington launched a military campaign to destroy al-Qaeda and overthrow the Taliban government, accusing it of harboring terrorist organizations with overwhelming technological superiority, including stealth aircraft, satellites, drones, and elite special operations forces. The United States believed it could defeat its enemy quickly. The reality on the battlefield, however, proved to be very different. The Taliban retreated into Afghanistan's rugged mountainous terrain, shifted to guerrilla warfare, and drew the U.S. into a conflict that lasted for 2 decades. Over the course of 20 years, Washington repeatedly adjusted its strategy, moving from counterterrorism operations to nation-building and government reconstruction. Despite spending more than $2.3 trillion and investing enormous resources in establishing a new Afghan government, these efforts ultimately failed to create a stable foundation capable of surviving after U.S. forces withdrew. In August 2021, the world witnessed chaotic scenes at Kabul's airport as thousands of people desperately tried to flee Afghanistan. Within a matter of days, the Western-backed government collapsed, while the Taliban swiftly regained control of the country. Images of the rushed evacuation significantly damaged America's credibility and reputation on the international stage. In addition, a substantial amount of military equipment, including armored vehicles, helicopters, infantry weapons, and other advanced hardware, was left behind and later fell into Taliban hands. As a result, a force that had once relied primarily on guerrilla tactics suddenly gained access to a large and sophisticated arsenal. The U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan also created a power vacuum in Central Asia. Other major powers quickly expanded their diplomatic ties and regional influence, while Washington's strategic position in the region declined significantly after 2 decades of military presence. The third mistake, the Nixon Shock of 1971. Beyond military decisions, another major turning point came on August 15, 1971, when President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would suspend the convertibility of the U.S. dollar into gold. This decision effectively brought the Bretton Woods system to an end. Established after World War II, the system had been designed to promote stability in the global financial order. At the time, the United States was burdened by the enormous costs of war and expanding domestic social programs, causing the supply of U.S. dollars in circulation to far exceed the nation's gold reserves. As more countries began demanding to exchange their dollars for gold under the existing agreement, Washington faced the risk of exhausting its gold reserves and ultimately decided to close the so-called gold window. Once the dollar was no longer backed by gold, the modern era of fiat currency began. Central banks gained greater flexibility in conducting monetary policy, but the new system also increased the risk of inflation and currency depreciation as governments gained the ability to expand the money supply more freely. Throughout the 1970s, many economies experienced persistently high inflation, soaring oil and commodity prices, slowing economic growth, and declining living standards. These economic disruptions spread across the world and had particularly severe consequences for developing nations over the long term. The end of the gold standard fundamentally transformed the structure of the international financial system. National currencies were no longer directly tied to tangible assets, but instead depended largely on public confidence in governments and central banks. This new monetary environment also contributed to recurring cycles of asset booms and busts, affecting everything from real estate and stock markets to increasingly complex financial instruments. Nixon's decision enabled the United States to overcome its immediate financial challenges. But it also ushered in a new era for the global economy, one in which fluctuations in currency values, inflation, and public debt became persistent issues for decades to come. Mistake number 4. The Vietnam War 1965. To understand why the United States faced decades of economic challenges and declining public confidence, it is impossible to overlook the Vietnam War. In 1965, the U.S. officially deployed ground combat forces to Da Nang, shifting from an advisory role to direct military involvement on an increasingly large scale. American policymakers believed that their overwhelming advantages in air power, artillery, and advanced military technology would quickly secure victory against a country with far more limited military resources. U.S. troop levels eventually exceeded 500,000 personnel, accompanied by some of the most intensive bombing campaigns ever conducted in an effort to weaken the enemy's ability to resist. However, the prolonged conflict demonstrated that military superiority alone could not determine the outcome of the war. Guerrilla warfare, deep familiarity with the terrain, and the determination of Vietnamese forces drew the United States into a costly war of attrition. After years of heavy casualties and mounting expenses, Washington withdrew its troops in 1973, marking one of the most significant military setbacks in American history. The war cost approximately $160 billion at the time, equivalent to well over $1 trillion in today's dollars. To finance the conflict, the U.S. government significantly increased borrowing and expanded the money supply, placing substantial pressure on the federal budget. These financial strains are widely regarded as one of the factors that contributed to the decision to end the gold standard in 1971. At home, the war also deeply divided American society. Anti-war protests spread across college campuses and major cities, while thousands of veterans returned with lasting physical and psychological wounds. The conflict left a profound and enduring impact on American politics, the economy, and public sentiment. From a geopolitical perspective, the Vietnam War became a lesson in the limits of military power. By intervening in a highly complex conflict without fully accounting for its historical background, cultural dynamics, and the level of local public support, Washington became trapped in a prolonged war whose costs continued to rise while its strategic effectiveness steadily declined. Mistake number 5. The repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act 1999. If America's wars revealed the limitations of military power, the financial reforms of 1999 highlighted the risks associated with economic policy. That year, the United States repealed much of the Glass-Steagall Act, legislation enacted after the Great Depression to separate commercial banking from investment banking. Supporters argued that deregulation would make the financial sector more competitive and stimulate economic growth. However, removing the barrier between deposit-taking institutions and high-risk investment activities also encouraged many financial institutions to expand speculative operations on an unprecedented scale. Banks became increasingly involved in the stock market, real estate, and complex financial derivatives. Large amounts of inexpensive credit flowed into the housing market, fueling rapidly rising home prices while also expanding mortgage lending to borrowers with weak creditworthiness. This process significantly increased risks throughout the financial system. When the housing market eventually reversed course, mortgage defaults surged, inflicting enormous losses on banks and laying the foundation for the global financial crisis that erupted in 2008. The episode became one of the most prominent examples of the consequences of inadequate financial oversight. Financial regulators and policymakers in Washington failed to respond promptly to growing imbalances within the financial system as bad loans accumulated and the housing market overheated. When the real estate bubble burst in 2008, numerous financial institutions fell into crisis. triggering a chain reaction that spread across the global economy. The 2008 financial crisis caused stock markets to plunge, sharply reduced the wealth of American households, and left millions of people unemployed or facing foreclosure because they could no longer meet their mortgage payments. To prevent a complete collapse of the banking system, the U.S. government introduced bailout programs worth trillions of dollars to support major financial institutions, significantly increasing the national debt in the years that followed. Beyond its economic damage, the crisis also weakened many countries' confidence in the Western financial model. In its aftermath, numerous economies accelerated efforts to reduce their dependence on the U.S.-led financial system and began exploring new frameworks for international financial cooperation aimed at reducing future systemic risks. Mistake number 6. Prohibition in 1919. In addition to its controversial decisions on war and finance, the United States also experienced a major domestic policy failure with the adoption of the 18th Amendment in 1919. This amendment prohibited the production, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages nationwide. Its primary goals were to improve public morality, reduce crime, and increase workplace productivity. Supporters believed that banning alcohol would create a more civilized and disciplined society. In reality, however, the opposite occurred. The demand for alcohol did not disappear, it simply moved underground, fueling the rapid growth of an illegal black market. The enormous profits generated by the black market provided organized crime groups with abundant financial resources to expand their operations. Criminal organizations established extensive smuggling networks, used violence to fight over territory, and sought to bribe law enforcement officials. Figures such as Al Capone became lasting symbols of the explosive rise of organized crime in the United States during the Prohibition era. After years of enforcement, Prohibition failed to achieve its original objectives. Instead, it created a wide range of unintended consequences affecting public safety, the economy, and government administration. Eventually, the U.S. government was forced to repeal the policy, making it one of history's clearest examples of how a law introduced with good intentions can produce harmful unintended consequences when it conflicts with basic market forces and social realities. From an economic standpoint, Prohibition deprived the federal government of one of its most important sources of tax revenue. At a time when the nation needed financial resources to recover from World War I, the federal budget faced a significant loss of income. Meanwhile, rather than reducing crime as expected, the government had to spend even more on law enforcement agencies, the court system, and prisons to combat bootlegging and organized crime. Despite these increased expenditures, corruption, violence, and illegal alcohol trafficking continued to spread throughout the country. After more than a decade in effect, the policy was widely recognized as a failure. In 1933, the United States officially repealed the 18th Amendment, bringing the Prohibition era to an end and acknowledging the limitations of using administrative measures to solve complex social and market-related problems. Conclusion: the chain reaction of strategic decisions. Looking back at 6 pivotal decisions in American history, it becomes clear that every major policy has produced consequences far beyond its original objectives. Whether it was a financial law, a military campaign, or a domestic policy, the effects often spread across the economic, political, and international landscape. Some decisions were expected to strengthen America's strategic position but instead produced unintended outcomes. The Iraq War reshaped the balance of power in the Middle East. The Afghanistan campaign ended with the Taliban returning to power, and the abandonment of the gold standard ushered in the era of fiat currency, bringing decades of inflationary pressures and financial volatility around the world. These events demonstrate that in an increasingly interconnected world, every major decision made by a global power can trigger a chain reaction that extends well beyond its own borders. Military strength, economic power, and technological leadership are not always enough to control the complex forces of history, culture, market dynamics, and geopolitical change. One important lesson is that the greater a nation's influence, the more carefully it must weigh decisions that could reshape history. Power vacuums, mounting financial burdens, and declining international confidence following major policy mistakes have affected not only the United States but have also contributed to the gradual evolution of a more multipolar world order. Over the past several decades, today, the world is witnessing a shift in the global balance of power as more countries seek to diversify their economic partnerships, establish new alliances, and reduce their dependence on a single financial center. This illustrates that the international order is constantly evolving according to broader historical and economic forces, and no dominant position can last forever without adapting to changing circumstances. By examining these 6 turning points in American history, we can see that every strategic choice leaves a lasting legacy not only for the United States but for the entire world. They also serve as a reminder that major policy decisions should always be made with great caution, as their consequences can extend across generations. In your opinion, which of these decisions had the greatest impact on America's global standing? Is the rise of a multipolar world an inevitable result of these developments, or will other factors ultimately shape the future? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue the discussion.
If you found this analysis informative, please like, subscribe, and share this video so more people can join the conversation. Your support motivates us to continue producing in-depth analyses of geopolitics, economics, and the major trends shaping our world. Thank you for watching until the end. We hope you continue to approach global events with critical thinking, a broad perspective, and an open mind as the world continues to change. Goodbye, and we'll see you in our next analysis.